of the University of California, thank you for tuning in to today's webinar hosted by UC Alumni Career Network. My name is Rose Nakamoto, and I serve as the director of the Career Center at Santa Clara University and a very proud UC Santa Cruz alumnus. I'm honored to be moderating today's event focused on career management, tips for managing others. We're really thrilled that we have over 4,500 alumni registered for today's event. This program is part of a UC-wide effort to support and unite alumni across our 10 campuses. We aim to equip you with insights, tools, and connections necessary to help you launch, grow, or expand your career. Throughout today's session, please ask questions of our speaker by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or by emailing alumni@ucop.edu. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Our discussion today will focus on a timely topic of managing and inspiring others. And we'll be diving into strategies for new managers, addressing challenging situations like the one that we're experiencing right now, delegation, and leading diverse teams. I'm so pleased to be joined by UCLA alumna Chris MacLaughlin, who serves as the Chief Marketing Officer for Global Partner Ecosystem at IBM. Chris is an experienced executive and leader who has developed many teams and a variety of teams throughout her career. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you very much, Rose.
Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into our first question. Starting with your journey, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about your path to leadership and how you landed your current role?
Sure, absolutely, Rose. Well, like you, I'm a proud alumnus of the University of California system from Los Angeles. And my journey actually started on campus at the Career Center as an intern and grew from there. I had a career in advertising, segueing over to general marketing, and then moving my way up through the chain there. I really came to this role, interestingly enough, by preparing earlier in my career. I spent a lot of time in channel marketing and then went off and explored other parts of marketing. And this opportunity became available, and they came back to me because of my prior experience. So it was one of those things, as they say, you know, luck is preparation and opportunity coming together, and this is how I was lucky enough to come to this role.
Wonderful, Chris. And I think what feels timely for everyone and urgent is this current landscape and uncertainty that we're all experiencing. So if we could just dive into challenging situations, how can leaders support and inspire their teams and their people in times of crisis? And if you could share with us what instincts you've had to lean on as a leader in these recent weeks.
Sure. Well, and I think it's interesting, you know, I sort of look at this current environment that we're in and this sort of hyper reality is sort of, it's equivalent to listening to music at home and then going to listen to it live. It's the same music, but it feels more urgent. You're more in touch with it. You feel it in your bones when you're in the arena or you're in the concert hall. And that's sort of how this moment feels, more urgent, more direct, and still calling on all the things that you know as a leader, that you're anticipating needs, you're helping your team navigate, you're communicating those priorities to them, you're listening to them, you're learning from them, and you're leading them. And so I think it's the same way now. And if I had to visualize it, I sort of think of it as like a Venn diagram. So one circle is managing and one circle is leading. And in the moment that a crisis happens, those two circles come together and there's a lot of overlap. And then over time, they start separating apart. And what you need to think about as a leader is, what are the things you're managing and what are the things you're leading? And managing are those things that we know instinctively day to day. You're defining the priorities, you're making trade-offs on how you spend your time, and you've identified who your decision makers are. They're going to handle things. Now, leading is forward-looking. Leading is, depending upon your situation, it could be next week, next month, next quarter, next year. How are you going to take where you are, adapt, and pivot? So you've got your playbook. Well, first thing you do in a crisis, look at that playbook and say, what do I need to keep doing? And what am I going to pause? And what am I going to pivot to? And where are you going to point your resources and your team members to focus on? And second, you want to make sure that you're super connected to your front line in a crisis. How are they feeling? How are they doing? How are they getting by each day? And what we're seeing in this situation is that it's evolving over time. So people had sort of the countdown to what is going to happen and the anticipation and the anxiety of what would happen. Then we got our work from home directives, and we've seen that play out in different parts of the world and across the country. And now people have been working from home for a couple of weeks. So now the question is, what next? When are we going to transition back? And that's still undetermined. So that's causing a lot of stress for people. And then, you know, as you think about, okay, you're connected to the front lines, you're talking to them, they also need to understand, what are the new priorities? What does your dashboard look like? What can they expect from you as a leader? And what's also expected of them? And how are we going to manage through it? So, like I said, it feels like the same kind of thing when you listen to music at home versus you go into the concert hall. It's just hyper real. That's how I feel about leadership in this moment. It's the stuff you know, but you're really having to be ruthless in how you're prioritizing your time and where you're spending your energy.
Absolutely, Chris. And actually, how you manage and toggle between the tactical pieces of the management role and then the visionary pieces of leadership, which includes inspiration. And I think that to be inspiring for others, to be an inspiration for others, we have to first have a readiness and an ability to act at our highest level. So I would love to know, as you're navigating these spheres of leadership, certainly right now, can you tell us about someone that you've worked for who's been instrumental in your growth? And how do you stay inspired, and how do you inspire others?
Yeah, there's been so many people that have been fantastic, but one person that comes to mind I'll describe. This was somebody that had the ability to be a great storyteller, could bring things together and carry you on the journey. And I think that's a big part of what this experience is. I think it's also helping people understand that there is going to be another side and how to get there and what that's going to look like. For me personally, what this person did is I was at that point in my career where I had had a really good toolbox of skills, but I needed to jump up to that next level. And this was the person that was the supportive guide when I needed it. And there were times where I wasn't as successful as I wanted to be. And what I found is that they were very good at saying, so if you could do this again, what would you do differently? What would you do better? And it was really a moment of self-reflection versus the person telling me what to do. It forced me to do it. And, you know, what I found was having that experience of somebody forcing you to think about it and what your next steps were was really helpful to me, because then I could draw on that experience the next time. And I think that's sort of what we're in now. You know, it's an extraordinary moment. It's unprecedented, but certainly there have been moments of crisis before. And whether it was a natural disaster, a brush fire, an earthquake, something that, you know, was, you know, human made. We've been through these before, and that's where I think leaders quickly go back through the memory bank and you start playing, okay, what situation was like this before? What can I bring from that experience to this experience?
Mm-hmm. You actually just raised something that I think is really important, is how can leaders help their teams and their people stretch and grow? And you shared a tremendous example of someone who helped you do that through reflection. And so I'd love to explore that some more in terms of how can people, how can new managers or even senior to mid-level managers really help their people build capacity around growth? And do you think that's possible right now?
I do. And I think, you know, now managers, one of the skills they need to really draw on is patience, because with the work from home environment, people are juggling so many things at once that we've got to be even more understanding and have some more latitude in how things get done and to the degree that we can when things get done. So one of the techniques that I use when I see a piece of work that I know the person has struggled to complete due to lack of time, not lack of understanding of it, if I've got the ability to extend the deadline, I'll ask them, I said, you know, if you had a couple more days, what would you do to this presentation? What would you do to the proposal? And they immediately have 3, 4, 5 things that they would do because they were things they wanted to do and didn't get to it. And I say, you know what? Take the time, do that. Those sound like great ideas. And then by providing space and time for them to do their best work, when they come back, they feel really renewed and excited because they know it's their best work. And so to the degree I can, that's a technique I'm using now.
I love that, Chris. And actually, you're also giving people permission to be human. You're giving people permission and space and grace to be human right now. And so your action isn't punitive as a leader, it's giving them grace and space. So that is actually really a powerful thing that can help people feel like they can be at their best in times that are so uncertain. And you're right, people are juggling so much at home. And whenever have we been at home with family, loved ones, children, or we're caring for them while also trying to do work and being worried about the world around us. So what an unusual moment in time it is. I want to just quickly pause there because in a few minutes, we are going to start taking questions from the audience. So please remember to submit your questions for Chris in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or feel free to email alumni@ucop.edu. And also, I just want to share that we have over 1,000 alumni tuning in right now, Chris. So it's phenomenal. We're so excited you all are joining us today. If we can take a few steps back, Chris, to talk about your early days managing others and early leadership lessons that you learned. So if you think about your first experience managing people, what lessons did you learn and what do you wish you would have known before walking into that role?
Yeah, my first time as a manager was coming right out of undergraduate school. Never been a manager, and they said, here are people and manage them. And I had certainly, done things with group projects and that sort of thing, but it's a whole different thing when you're in the work world. And I think one of the things I learned early on was the importance of managing timelines and communicating timelines and understanding, how your actions affect others and how your team members, and understanding that not everybody works at the same pace and schedule that you do. So that sounds really fundamental, but that was the first lesson. I think the other thing is that the importance of people understanding what the goal is and how that relates to the overall work that's being done. So drawing that straight line connection between sort of what's the organization's goals, what's the group's goals, and what is the individual's goal. Because if the individual can see that straight line from what they do every day all the way up, they are more empowered and take better actions independently because they understand it versus being tightly scripted or prescribed on what they should be doing. If you say, this is the goal, here's where we need to get to by this date, and here's why it's important, I found that's really effective.
So providing people the context for the why behind their work and their actions?
Yeah.
Sounds really important.
The 3 most important words any manager can say, in my opinion, is, and here's why. So we're having a discussion about something that needs to be completed, and here's why. Pause, go over it, make sure it's understood, because once the why is fully understood, I've seen people excel. They run with it, they bring their best work, and they're happy themselves because they've taken charge of how they structure and get that work done.
Do you think that in part, Chris, is because people want to be mission driven? They want to understand how their work is part of something greater?
They do. And they want to make sure that they're not wasting their time and they're not doing something the hard way.
Yes.
That they can be most effective and efficient. And I think that's really important now, as you raised, with everybody working from home and the, multiple things that are sort of colliding in and around their workspace that they normally don't have to deal with.
As we're talking about some of these early lessons that you learned, we're getting a lot of questions coming in from the audience about managing and leading difficult team members. Can we spend a few moments on that, and what lessons have you learned in terms of insights you can share for leading difficult people or challenging personnel issues?
Yeah. Well, and I think it starts with understanding them. Where are they coming from? And it may feel like a difficult situation, but if you understand their situation and where they're coming from, it might make it easier and you can find some common ground. And then I think also, you've got to give people a chance to, with coaching, to do their best. And if after you get through that, you find out that it's not a good fit, then have the conversation about, what is fit. So I think that's a big part of it, but it starts with trying to get to know them and understand, what it is and what makes the relationship difficult, and try and isolate on it. And many times that's a communications issue, that they may not fully understand the goals, the missions, where to go. You may have thought you were clear. I've had certain situations where certainly I thought I was clear enough, but the person heard it in another way.
Right. Yes. And then what tools have you used as a manager? I mean, a lot of times I think young managers think that they have to be burdened alone with the responsibility of corrective measures, but there are partners in HR who can accompany you in that journey. What tools would you recommend to managers?
Yeah, what I would say is, one thing is peer coaching from other managers, to situations where if it's appropriate to have another manager join you, or you're working on a group project, let them know and ask them to observe and give you some feedback, because they may see it differently than you do, and there may actually be feedback that you need to hear and say, I know scenario. I know you said this person talks a lot in a meeting, but I noticed you cut them off, and maybe that's creating them, making them anxious so that they want to speak up even more. Maybe what you should do is let them share more, and then the next time they jump in, say, I've heard from you, Chris. Let's hear from somebody else, and I'll come back to you. Yeah. And having that observer there might help.
Actually, you've raised something that's really critical, which is vulnerability in leadership. How does vulnerability play into being a strong leader and being open to feedback, being open to growth, and balancing the two things?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I think, we've heard a lot about servant leadership, which is really how can leaders help teams solve problems and move forward. And that's part of asking the teams, what are their blockers? What do they need help with? So that way you can address it. And, sometimes, if a team member is resisting, technique I use is to say, what's worrying you? Because they're resisting, not because of a personality issue, but because they really do have a concern about the success or the approach, or they've had a prior experience that didn't work out. And by asking, what are you worried about, or what worries you, that allows them to express it. And you may learn something, you didn't know before, and then you can address it. So really, it really gets back to that really core communication. But servant leadership means you need to know what they need so you can empower them.
Yes, and giving them a space to not make assumptions as a leader about what's going on for them. There's a quote that I love about leadership and diversity in the workplace. It's really easy to make ourselves over complex as individuals. We see ourselves as complex individuals, and it's really easy to see someone else as very simple in comparison. And so to not oversimplify what we believe someone else's experience to be and make assumptions. So I love that recommendation to pause and actually take the moment to ask and to invite a conversation.
Yep.
Some of what we're getting in from the audience too, we have several questions coming in. Elena would like to know, can you please recommend any books, articles, or podcasts or other resources about management, leadership, and building confidence that would be helpful?
Oh, there's a couple things. After this, I'll share the information with Rose and we'll get it out to everybody. There were a couple of really interesting articles that I read about crisis in management that talk about, how to approach things. And what I found was knowledge is power. So you will be more confident if you know how to tackle the problem. And I think that's sort of our experience, having gone through university life, is the reason you go through all of those courses is to learn how to analyze, dissect, respond. And same thing in business, but there's some cases where we haven't encountered those situations before, and it may create uncertainty and doubt as a manager. So yes, I can get those resources to you, Rose.
Wonderful, thank you. I think I love the idea of helping leaders build self-efficacy around their own confidence and worthiness as a leader. I think that's such an important piece of being confident in who you are and what you bring to the table. You've referenced something earlier I want to draw back to, Chris, related to delegation. And I think, to be an effective manager means learning how to delegate effectively, certainly right now when our time is more precious than it ever has been, and we're having to pivot very quickly. But to become a strong leader, you really need to be able to learn how to prioritize and build vision. Can you walk us through how you set priorities and delegate and the techniques that you use to do this?
Sure. Well, I think, we've all heard of the dichotomy of urgent versus important, right? But one of the techniques that I use to try and determine where I'm going to focus my time and where I can delegate is to develop a mind map. So start with the core idea. What's the goal? What do we need to do? And then what are all the things that branch off of that and the various functions that I get involved in? And then look and see where I can bring some unique talent or skill and focus there, and where others on my leadership team can bring their talents and focus. And there might be times where we need to come together and we overlap each other on an issue, but to the degree that you can have clear swim lanes, that makes sense. And so I start with what is aligned, start with the priorities, being aligned to the organization and being super clear about what that alignment is, and then what things are going to move the needle. Now, at any given moment, that needle is on a different characteristic. That's why it's a dashboard, right? Right now we're going through a situation where it's about employee well-being, health and safety. So how am I doing as a leader to help people feel safe, ensure they are well, ensure they have the resources that they need to work effectively from home? It's also about client care. How are we addressing our clients' needs and making sure that in these uncertain times, they know that we are here for them, that we are still open, that business is still going on. It may not be business as usual, but business is still going on and they will be cared for. It can also be, business fundamentals. What is the financial reality of the situation? What about business continuity? What about supply chain? So as I map all of those out, I look where I have unique skill and talent. And as a leader, having built the leadership team, I should have complementary skills with my leaders and have them cover the other areas. And as a leadership team, you'd want to build that mind map together so that it's obvious what are the priorities and who is over each one. And so there's consensus. And then very important step is to take that when you're in that moment of pivoting is to communicate that out to the team so everybody understands the pivot and acknowledge the pivot. Say, we were here, this unique situation has happened, or this market dynamic has happened, and we are pivoting. Or we anticipate this market action, so we are taking action now to leapfrog and get ahead. That's a big part of, you know, deciding the priorities, the delegation, but the communication is the key element that makes it all work.
So it's a powerful thing to be able to name the experience that's happening, to name it, to draw a line in the sand, and then say where action will take place. And then you also reference something that's really powerful, to learn how to proactively activate your people and to identify their strengths and to make sure you're helping them to be part of the solution. And you talk a lot about collaborative leadership. You engage your people really closely in the direction forward that you take. And so I think that's a really helpful lesson to take with us. I want to talk about the diversity of teams that people may be managing, and whether that's because they're globally distributed, but we know that teams are looking different, whether it's generational differences, and you've led and you continue to lead a diverse range of teams. And I imagine the people that you work with have a variety of values, preferences, and personalities. What advice can you give to a leader about how to customize your approach and your style to meet different team members?
I think it starts with, you know, the assumption that you need to customize, and I think that's true. And you know, interestingly, you know, I've had a global career, lived in the States, lived in the Middle East, you know, worked multinationally for a long, long time, traveled to 65 different countries so far. And what I can tell you is there's sort of three universals of people. One is everybody loves their children and wants a better future for them. Second, everybody has traditions of some kind around holidays. And third, everybody has a favorite food that you must try. And when I'm meeting new people and getting to know them, those are sort of the areas I come back to. I say, tell me about, what's the holiday you celebrate? How do you typically experience that holiday? Are there special foods? And people just light up and they get so excited and they want to tell you about it. And that's a moment of connection and sameness, but also celebrating difference and diversity and sharing. And so I think that's part of what it is recognizing that teams are better with diverse points of view, united around common goal, because you want people that can solve problems in different ways, because you're going to have a unique situation that comes up. You know, for example, this situation that we're all going through here, you know, I was asking my team about situations, you know, they've gone through that were difficult and how did they navigate it. And it was interesting what came up. You know, some people, you know, had relatives that had gone through really difficult situations. Somebody's relatives had lived through a war and talked about how they came through the war. Some remember talking to relatives about the Great Depression. Some had relatives that had, you know, immigrated to the United States, and what was that experience coming through Ellis Island. And so by having people talk about those kinds of things was really helpful, because then you learned about human resiliency and problem solving and how people just help each other. And what came through it, I said, when you talk to your relatives about how they got through that situation, what happened? And they said they just stuck together and there was no alternative. They were going to get through it, and they were going to get through it together. And so I think that's another way to sort of honor that diversity and create inclusion, is to have those kind of conversations where it opens it up and create the space for people to share and to bring that from their background that you might not have known, and find it very helpful. And you get to know people better in a way. And that's what I'm finding, you know, on all of the WebEx and Zoom calls I'm doing. You know, I'm literally going into people's homes. I am getting to know them in a way I didn't before. You know, I see the art on the walls. I see the pictures on the desk. I see, you know, the children that inevitably come in, or, you know, the furry friends that are there, the partners, the spouses, husbands, wives. And so you really do get a glimpse into somebody's life. And so, you know, while nobody would have wanted this to happen, it's been a real blessing to be able to get to know people on that deeper level.
That's tremendous. And actually, I bet that is a good way to build trust. I've often thought that this moment is a really important moment to build and secure trust with your people. And I also think it's a moment where you could lose trust very quickly, whether it's in your clients or in your workforce, if they're not felt like their needs are being cared for and tended to. And I think what you're just describing is the acknowledgement and the learning of who your people are and how it informs the culture of your teams. We have a lot of really great questions coming in. So Chris, if you don't mind, maybe we'll start to pivot to some of our audience questions, which I'm really excited to dig into. Now, the first one that I want to jump into is from Tanya. And this is really great. This is about leading from the middle and how many of us are managers who lead from the middle. So do you have tips for managers when you're working in a very hierarchical environment? So being in a mid-level position, having to regularly check in with those above you and below you, and do a lot of reporting back and forth.
Yes. Hi, Tanya. Thanks for the question. Yes, managing from the middle. Yep, that is a really critical place in an organization. Because for your employees, you're the first line of defense, maybe the second line of defense, and then you're helping filter from above. At the same time, you're getting exposed to information above you, and you're making that decision on how to filter it. So I think one of the key things you can do is to be that really good communicator and take what you're hearing that comes to you and filtering it and giving that context, as you were saying, Rose. How, you know, why is this piece of information important to you, and how does it impact what we do as a team and individuals? That's one of the most important things you can do. I think the other thing is when you're in the middle, there is a lot of pressure on you. And so just remember that and acknowledge it. And particularly in this kind of a stressful situation, you know, you're trying to manage your own home and your own personal life and your own professional life, you know, as well as looking out for your team. So take care of yourself. Do that self-nurturing, that self-care, whether it's meditation, exercise, you know, special nutrition, whatever you need to do, do that so that you maintain your resiliency and your strength.
Yeah, that's so great. That's so true, because that position can be one that can be challenging at times to navigate. Chris, can you share some guidance about transparency in that same position, being in the middle? And I think the question is, as you're sort of being an excellent communicator up and down and out, how can you be transparent with your team so that they understand the position that you're in and how you're helping guide them in this broader context? So what kind of transparency is appropriate here?
Yeah, I think there's a couple kinds of transparency. Now, obviously, you know, as a middle manager, you may be exposed to information ahead of the rest of the organization. You may have specific fiduciary responsibilities. So you have to be mindful of those things and act accordingly. And there may be times where the plot is evolving and you don't want to take it to the team too soon if it's going to change and it's going to become destabilizing for them. So I think, again, it's context so that they understand what's going on. I think, unfortunately, many of us may be in a situation where we've got to communicate information on staffing and, you know, redundancy programs. And those are always difficult. And I think those you obviously can't divulge before they need to be divulged, but you've got peers that you can go to and have those conversations and have that mutual support. So go there, and then at the right time, share it as you need to. But I think you do need to be judicious with transparency. If you think it's going to destabilize or derail the team on what they need to get done, and only you will know. And if you're uncertain about it, then talk to a peer or talk to a senior manager before you share that with the team. And I think, you know, what all of us want to know is clarity. Where are we going? What are we doing? What can we anticipate coming down the road? So the degree to which you can share that, or in this case, you know, because we're dealing with COVID-19 and we're learning as we go as a world, part of that is having that conversation and saying, you know, everybody's hearing the news every day and saying, right, well, we're just going to keep going and we're figuring this out. And, you know, what do we need to be good today? That's the managing. And then what do we need in the future? And that's the leading.
Yeah, I love that. And that takes time to build that kind of hone those judgment skills. Really strong instinctive good judgment is such a critical value for a leader to develop, and to know how to use emotional intelligence to gauge your team and what's appropriate to share and when. It does take time to build that understanding. So thank you for that, Chris. We've got another great question coming in from Diana. So Diana, thank you for your question. And I've seen this trend happen quite a bit with leaders who are early in their career. So this is really especially geared for a younger manager. How can you balance being collegial with your team and being well liked by your employees while also exhibiting and exerting an executive presence? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, hi Diana. That's a really good question, and I think being liked and being a leader are not mutually exclusive. I think what people want in a leader is consistency. They want that person to communicate, and they want that person to treat them fairly. And I think, you know, as a leader, you can do all of those things, and you can do it in a way that somebody can hear you. And there was a phrase somebody told me a long time ago, which is, say what you mean, but just don't say it meanly. And so I think that gets to, you know, tone of voice, presentation, picking your moment, that sort of thing. But I think there is a distinction. You do need to, you know, have some separation between if you're the manager or the leader versus the team, because there are moments where you are going to have to make the hard decision because you are the leader, and you need a little bit of space to be able to do that with some judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that also, Chris, to add to that, I think sometimes it's learning how to set appropriate boundaries for yourself and not internalizing others' perceptions of you to the extent that it's detrimental. So how to set boundaries as a leader to care about your team while also maintaining the integrity of what's right on behalf of your unit is really important, and take some time to understand how to do that effectively.
The other note to share, Diana, is as a leader, you've got a different peer group. So make sure that you're well entrenched in your peer group of other leaders, other managers, that you can have those collegial kinds of conversations with, because that will give you some emotional support and a foundation to grow from, separate and apart from the interactions with your team. And it's important to get that as well as the interactions from your team.
Oh, Chris, that's so important. I love to call those lifelines. So it's absolutely essential as a new manager that you build lifelines, perhaps inside your organization, but certainly outside of your organization, that you can turn to for support and brainstorming. That's so critical. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
So our next question comes from Marie, and she'd like to know about delivering constructive feedback. And you touched on this a little bit, Chris, in terms of, you know, having a type of communication that doesn't make it personal. How do you engage in providing constructive feedback to colleagues, as certainly colleagues who may be more senior to you, someone you're managing that has difficulty with a more senior manager. So it sounds like, Marie, you're wanting to learn how to navigate a situation giving feedback up with someone who has had a track record of difficulty experiencing feedback around a more senior leader. So we could talk more generally about constructive feedback and then how to do so with someone who's above you.
Sure. Well, and you know, feedback is a gift. And, you know, if somebody's going to take the time to share with you their thoughts, it's worth your time to listen to them. And I think the approach on constructive feedback is you sort of do the three-parter. You know, you lead with, you know, here's what I've observed that you do really well, and get 2 or 3 specific things you can talk about, and then say, and you know what? If you applied the same kind of enthusiasm you do to those 3 things to this thing, that would be even better. And then you close with another positive. So positive, something to work on, positive. And I find this technique is really helpful when you're doing upline or to senior managers, right? And say, you know, one of the things I think you do really well is this. So let me give you an example. I had a manager who was incredibly personal one-on-one, but went up in front of the room, became sort of wooden and stiff. And so they said, you know, do you have any feedback for me? And that's a really personal thing. And I said to him, I said, you know what? You are so great one-on-one. I said, you know, people really get a lot out of talking to you. You know, I walk by your office, there's always laughter. You're always teaching. You know, people get so much out of their interactions with you. I said, you know, I just wish there was a way that we could translate that to a bigger audience. And he's like, really? I said, yeah. I said, you know what? Like at the next all hands call, how about you do some of that? How about you, you know, bring some of that sense of humor? Why don't you bring, you know, that teaching and talk about a couple of things? I said, I think people really get a lot out of it. And they said, thanks. And then I said, yeah. And then, you know, wrapped it up with another thing. And the person took the feedback, and the next time they got up in front of a crowd, they were much better and much more relatable. But they had the impression that they had to somehow act as a leader. And in their mind, a leader was this very wooden, stiff kind of a person, versus leading really is connecting with people and sharing the vision and having them come along on the journey. So
yes,
positive, yeah. Something, you know, apply that same kind of technique to whatever you want them to work on, and then close with something.
I love that formula, and it's so easy to follow up with some practice. And Chris, you also just gave a great example of a time where you were soliciting strengths in someone who wasn't really recognizing the strengths that they were bringing to the table, and really asking them to show up with that in an authentic way, right? So you weren't encouraging this person to be anything different from what they are. You were just asking them to draw that out. And what a powerful thing to encourage someone to do, to sync up with what their strengths are and to then nudge them along. What an affirmative experience. I'd like to talk a little bit about independent contributor versus leader or manager, and the pros and the cons to both. We have Emily writing in who's wanting to know, can you offer insight on deciding to go down a management route versus continuing as an individual contributor? And maybe, Chris, you can lean on your experience as a manager and how it's fulfilled you and brought depth to your professional career being a manager, and the pros and cons as you see them.
Sure. Well, Emily, that's a really important question, and I think that comes back to the individual. And I know organizationally there's a feeling like you have to get on the management track to be successful, but I'd really say, what matters to you as an individual? You know, do you take joy in working deeply and specifically on something and getting it over the finish line yourself? Or do you like to work in a group environment? Do you want to have other people that are responsible for parts of the project, and together you get satisfaction out of completing it? And I think that's really an important thing. And it certainly depends what profession you're in, whether, you know, the solo contributor or individual contributor role will get you to the professional level you're looking for or not. You know, in some cases in technical fields, there's been a recognition that people are amazingly gifted in technology, but they may not be somebody who wants to be a leader of other people. So I've been in organizations where they've created whole career paths for individual contributors because of that. And then folks have self-identified and said, you know, I'd like to be a manager, and they start down that road. So I think it really starts with you. I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way. It really depends on what you think your skills are, what makes you happy, what makes you feel fulfilled, and where you want to go in your career. And you may face the tough decision that at some point you've got to pick one path or the other to be happy.
Thank you, Chris, because I do know that the extrinsic pressure or feeling you referenced here, that to grow means to become a leader, to manage others, and that may not necessarily be authentic for everyone and the right path for everyone. So how to divide up between the external pressure for that and the intrinsic sort of motivation and what's right for you is so important to pay attention to. So I appreciate that, certainly. Chris, actually, would you mind sharing with us sort of the energy that you get as a leader? You know, what does that look like for you? And you know, a lot of leaders, you talk about making impact at scale. Is that true for you, or what really sort of lights you up when you think about your impact?
I think there is that, but I think it starts with, for me, it's creating. So I'm in the marketing profession. I came out of the advertising world. So for me, the idea of creating something that's never existed before and taking it to market and seeing it have an impact, that really excites me. And typically, these are things that involve large groups of people. So I've always worked collaboratively. I'm very comfortable with that. That really excites me.
And so if you can hone in on whatever that value is, or whatever the energy source for your work is, and build capacity around that, whether that involves a leadership role or not, I think that's so important to pay attention to. So thank you, Chris. We've got another question from Shaniqua. She's asking about when you're coming in from outside an organization as a new leader, what should be your initial priorities? Great question.
Yeah. Hi, Shaniqua. This is one of the toughest things to do to come into an organization. And I think first thing is, to the degree that you can, quickly get deeply entrenched in what the strategy is, and if it's relevant, the history of the organization. Because there's going to be moments where people reference events before you were with the company or in the group, and it's helpful to you to have that background and certainly know the strategy so you can quickly contribute ideas that are in line with that strategy. And then equally important is, who are your peers? Who are your leaders? Who are those folks that are the movers and shakers in the organization that you need to get aligned to, so that way your ideas will get implemented? I think, Rose, you were sort of referencing this earlier about how important it is to make those connections across the organization so that you can recognize and get things done. And I think as you come into a new organization, it's also important to understand what is the social norm or the social contract within the organization. You know, is it an organization that believes in working collaboratively, and the norm is that people work across groups together? Or is it everybody hunkers down and drives something forward on their own? And understand which organization you're in. Because if you're in a collaborative one and you come in and you just hunker down and bulldoze ahead, people may misinterpret what you're trying to get done or how you're doing it. So it's very important to have, Rose, as you were talking about, that emotional intelligence and the antennae up about what's the nature of the organization you've joined.
I love that. That social currency of an organization and understanding what that is, and the culture currency, and then how to navigate that. That context piece is so critical. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I'm going to take it from Mary. And this is such a great one. How do I solicit feedback, honest feedback about myself as a leader?
Hi, Mary. Thank you for asking that question. I think there's a couple ways you can do it. I've been in organizations where it's part of the regular quarterly performance discussion, where, you know, I as a leader am sitting down with my team members individually, and we're having discussion about what happened during the quarter. And then I routinely say, well, and how can I help you better? Do you have feedback for me? Are there things that you would like me to do more, things you'd like me to do less? And I ask for the feedback. You can also do, you know, a formalized, you know, survey, that kind of thing. But I think, you know, one way to do it in a less formal way is I have a manager who's fantastic at this. You know, we'll have a discussion about something and we'll end the discussion. And they'll say, you know, I really enjoyed that discussion with you. Is there something that I could have done to contribute more to that conversation, or to help you with your thinking, or help you, you know, plan the next steps? And they ask in the moment, and they're looking for micro feedback. And, you know, certainly, Mary, you don't need to do it every time, but, you know, if there's a conclusion of a big project, or a presentation that was important, or a meeting that was important, when you come out as a team, you know, and everybody's talking about, hey, and then that happened, and then this happened, and hey, and that person said this, and that built on your point, and people are excited, you say, yeah, that's great. So, you know, is there anything that, you know, if we were going to do it again, what would we do? And then get them thinking that way, and then say, is there anything that I could have done? And, you know, you have to kind of take that deep breath. Once you put it out there, you're going to hear something back, and people will be willing to give you feedback if they sense that you are receptive and that you take it in the right way, and you take it that feedback is a gift.
I love that idea of feedback as a gift, as is gratitude. And so building that trust, Chris, with your teams to have that safe conversation. I do also love asking my team, you know, what blockers are you experiencing, if removed, would enable you to move forward more readily? And then what can I do to help you? What can I do differently, or what can I do more of? Or what can I stop doing? All of those things to build trust will enable for that conversation to flow much more freely. So before we wrap up our conversation, this has been such a dynamic conversation. Thank you for everyone for weighing in with your questions. Chris, I want to give you a few moments to share a couple pieces of remaining feedback with our audience. If there's anything else we didn't get a chance to ask you that you'd love to share.
Well, I want to say thank you to everybody for all the questions. They were all the ladies. So I love that the women, you're stepping forward. That's fantastic. And what I would say is leadership is not gender specific. It's not specific to, you know, any demographic. It really comes from within. And I think, you know, in this moment, everybody can be a leader. Whether you're a designated leader or you're somebody on a team, you've got something special to bring to this moment. And I think the other thing is, all of us as business people embed this in our memory. These kind of moments don't come along very often. You know, when you hear people talking about, oh, the financial crisis of '87, the 2008, the 2 bombings at the World Trade Center, MERS, SARS, these are separated by years. And these are things that will go into your memory banks, and they become the things that you draw on as a manager and as a leader, going back and saying, remember when that happened? This is what we did. So my ask to all of you is just be hyper aware as we continue through this journey, because at some point in the future, and I can't say when, but I will say it will happen, you will come back to these memories and call on them. So be aware of what they are, pay attention, and think of this was helpful or that wasn't helpful. Take lessons from both sides of the spectrum and just remember them and tuck them away, because at some future point, might be 3 years, might be 5 years, might be 10 years, might be 15 years, you're going to come back to this moment.
Wow, what a fantastic way to close our conversation, Chris. Your warmth and your sharp insights have really made me feel especially proud to be part of the UC community. It's been such an honor to have a chance to connect and interview you. So thank you, Chris, for your time, your generosity, and certainly your commitment to the University of California. I want to just take a couple moments to close up our time together to thank everyone for joining today on behalf of the University of California. It was honestly such a privilege to connect with each of you virtually today. We appreciate your making the time, and we hope that the advice that you learned from Chris today will really help inspire you forward. If you could just take a few minutes to fill out the survey gizmo, you should have gotten the link when you logged on and launched today's webinar. The feedback that you provide will really help us to shape future sessions, so please give your honest and open feedback. And then also we hope that you can join our upcoming webinar on a very timely topic. It'll focus on healthcare in the medicine field. On April 23rd, the UC Alumni Career Network will host another discussion with mid to senior level leaders. So please tune in for that. And in the meantime, thank you all again for joining. Please be well, take care, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, everybody.